Privatisation was a big thing in the 80s and 90s under Thatcher and Major. Many aspects of British society, many big bits of how the country worked, its infrastructure, were made private. And now it seems that things are going in the opposite direction because Labour, back in government, have accelerated plans to renationalise the railways. And the first operator is going to be renationalised in the spring. Excuse me, that is South Western Railway Services. Will be brought under government control in May. This is a franchise with First Group and MTR, that's a Hong Kong rail operator, is expiring. It's going to be followed by C2C, that runs services between London and Essex in July. Greater Anglia is going to switch to public control in the autumn. And South Western Railway, well, they run commuter and regional services from London Waterloo. They're going to be under the Department for Transport's DfT Operator Limited until Great British Railways have happened. So the question is whether this is a good thing and why it's happening. Well, Johnbosco Nwogbo is lead campaigner for We Own It. He is against privatisation. So presumably you welcome this, Johnbosco. But what's the good bit of it? Why is this good for taxpayers who might be asking, well, it was privatised and now we're renationalising it. Clearly something's gone wrong here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. I think it's useful for people to put this in the context of the fact that these are not the first privately run lines that are coming into public ownership. Over the last 14 years, the Conservative government have been taking the fairly radical step from their point of view of taking a number of privately run rail lines into public ownership because privatization has been failing passengers incredibly over the last 30 years. Just to highlight a few things about what has happened to our rail system under this privatized system. Every day in the year to April 2024, every day about 900 trains have been cancelled in our rail line, and which has essentially resulted in the private rail companies paying out around £100 million in compensation to passengers. The system is simply not working for passengers.
Is there any evidence to suggest that the system will work better if it's brought back under state control? Because it wasn't working previously, and the idea was to privatise it to make it more competitive and to make it work. You're saying that didn't work. I think I probably agree with you. But renationalising the railways, how do we know that would necessarily be better?
Absolutely. So there are a number of things that are important to say. We're not asking for it to go back to the system that we had before it was privatized. Why we know it's going to work is that right now about £1.5 billion is taken out of the system in profits. And obviously, if you think about it commonsensically, we have a system that has around 28 different private operators within the system, and all of them pulling in their own directions with an aim of making profits for themselves and their own shareholders. So they really don't care as much about the passenger, they just care about their own profit. And what this is going to do is that it's going to bring all of these companies or all of these operations under one roof and guided by a public sector organization run for the public good. Obviously, we think that there are more things that the government needs to do over and above public ownership. For example, Switzerland has the best railway system in the world. They invest about £477 into their rail system per person in the country. Right now, ours stands at around £211 per person. And as we know, for every £1 invested into the rail system, we generate more than £2.5 in economic activity. So it's really, really important that investment comes along with this.
Okay.
But this is a brilliant first step.
So, Johnbosco, you're saying, you know, companies run by the public for the public good. I mean, there have been many examples where the government does run things, does run parts of, not all, but parts of the prison system, for example, inefficiently, does run the NHS inefficiently. Just because something is in public ownership doesn't necessarily mean it's well run, does it?
I would not agree with the premise of that question. The NHS, on international analysis, is one of the most efficient railway systems, health systems in the world. The privately run...
It might be efficient, but when you look at the levels of people who are actually happy with it, you're looking at around 29% of people who are actually happy with their experience in the NHS. There are loads of people, as you know and I know, waiting for operations for a very, very long period of time, waiting in A&E. I'm not sure there are too many people who would say that it may be efficient in regard to other countries, but it's not efficient at the point of use. I mean, if you go privately, you can be seen immediately.
So that's a different question than efficiency, but that question ought to be put into the context of the fact that we spend per year, over the last 14 years that the Conservatives were in charge, we spent on average £40 billion less on our health system than France did. We spent 73 billion less than Germany did. Spending money matters in a public service. We simply did not put in enough resources into
But
that system
when the
to make it work.
NHS, I'm going to disagree with you on that. When the NHS came into, when the Conservatives took over in 2010, the NHS had, in England anyway, had £140 billion a year spent on it. Sorry, £139 billion a year spent on it. When they left office in 2024, the NHS had £180 billion a year. The Labour government has just put another £22 billion. So we've got over £200 billion being put into the NHS. It is not as efficient a system as many people certainly experience in their daily lives when they go into that system. So I suppose the question remains, just because something's in public ownership doesn't necessarily make it efficient. In fact, sometimes the opposite can be the case, can't it, Johnbosco?
Obviously, I think that that's a possibility, but we are looking at the evidence in front of us. Healthcare costs have gone up across the world, not just in the UK, but also other countries have put in far more into their health systems than we have. And it is within that context that we should be having a discussion.
And within that context, it's often the case, is it not, Johnbosco, that it's because of insurance programs, it's because of private healthcare aspects, it's because more money has come in through the different systems that they have. Because if you have socialised healthcare, for example, within the NHS, well, that, by your own admission, actually isn't being as efficient and as successful as other parts of the world where actually there is a private element to it or an insurance element to it. And my point, I suppose, within that argument is, again, we come back to this idea that just because something's nationalised doesn't necessarily mean that it works well.
I don't believe I've said any of that at all. I think that the evidence is right before us. The US, for example, spends something like 4 times per person on their healthcare as we do. We have better outcomes in the current NHS. That is not the best that it can be. We have better outcomes than they do. For several years, almost a decade, between 2010 and 2017, actually, the Commonwealth Fund, an American institution, ranked the NHS the best healthcare system in the world. It's a system that works if we invest in it properly. And what we've had is a decade of underinvestment. Lord Darcy's review made that clear. We've just had the most austere decade in the history of the NHS. What the government is beginning to do
what we've had, Johnbosco, I'm just thinking about this from the perspective of taxpayers, because what we've had is an NHS that's getting more money than it's ever got. We've got an NHS that we've got people who are taxed more than they've ever been taxed as a proportion of what the country makes since the Second World War. They're now being taxed even more as a result of that. Now we're bringing sometimes profitable businesses back into public ownership when it comes to the railways, and I can understand why you want that to happen. I get that. But again, it comes down to the fact that we have not demonstrated that things that are run publicly, like socialised medicine, run efficiently and run well, and that may well be the case when it comes to the railways.
I think that we have demonstrated that things that are run publicly are run more efficiently. As I have demonstrated, the NHS is far more efficient than the American or the European healthcare systems. We spend less on average. But they don't have
better outcomes. It may be more efficient, but it doesn't have better outcomes.
We also did have, for several decades, for several years within this last century, for several decades, the best healthcare outcomes in Europe, with the US as well. So it is just not true that things that are run in public hands are not run efficiently or don't have good outcomes. They have the best outcomes that we have seen in recent years. What we have seen happen to the NHS is that we've simply crossed the Rubicon in terms of how little money we can put into it for it to continue to produce the results.
It had a £41 billion increase over 14 years. There are very, very few areas of the public service and of what the government runs that would have had such a huge rise. It's just got another 22.6 billion.
I think it would be useful to see how much more the US have put into their system over that time, or how much more France or Germany have put into their system over that time.
But you're the one saying they're less efficient, Johnbosco.
They're less efficient, but they've also put in far more into their system. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, thank you very much for those points. Let's talk a little bit about British Steel, because it could be put under state control. Presumably you think that's a good idea as well?
we on it doesn't actually have a view on whether or not British Steel should be taken into public ownership. Obviously, we believe that where some good can be achieved by the government stepping in and running an industry, for example, such as British Steel, to the benefit of its workers or the country, because obviously steel is an important element for running the country. If we allowed British Steel to die, it might have other effects on our economy. So it's important for the government to step in and rescue it. So it has other benefits besides taking it to public ownership, so it works better for people. We tend to talk about public services as a whole, not industry, because we think there are other arguments that work better for industry. Sometimes it could work better in private hands, but in this case, British Steel could work better in public hands.
Okay, Johnbosco, thank you. Johnbosco Nwogbo, who is lead campaigner at We Own It.